Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the humid, chaotic rhythms of Rio de Janeiro, the sun rising like a hot copper coin over Guanabara Bay. Cargo ships slide silently into the port, cranes clank, and dock workers shout above the diesel growl of engines. You can almost smell the salt, the rust, and the faint chemical sweetness of contraband tucked away inside steel containers. Tonight, we're going to unravel the story of a man who mastered these shadows. Fernandinho Beira-Mar, Brazil's notorious cocaine don, who turned the country's busiest ports into his personal empire. And honestly, you probably wouldn't last 10 minutes where he was operating. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always amazed by how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The docks at sunrise are alive, but beneath that life hums something darker. Fernandinho Beira-Mar keeps a low profile, the kind of man who can be standing 20 feet away and you wouldn't notice. He's not the flash and chains type. No bright shirts, no expensive cars, just sharp eyes and a mind like a chessboard. In 2002, his reach is woven into the very fabric of these ports. Trucks haul bananas, coffee, and raw ore out to waiting ships. But tucked deep inside some of those containers are packages worth more than the entire shipment combined. Dockside operations like these didn't appear overnight. Years of cultivating friendships, or more accurately, dependencies, allowed Beira-Mar to build something nearly invisible. Workers who earn modest wages find themselves suddenly able to afford new motorbikes or renovations on their homes. Police officers discover mysterious envelopes that seem to refill just when bills pile up. And the port officials? Many of them would rather not look too closely at a container seal if it means their children's school fees are covered. Historical fact here: Brazil's ports have long been among the busiest in the southern hemisphere, moving millions of tons of cargo each year. The sheer volume made inspection a logistical nightmare even for the most earnest authorities, and Beira-Mar, ever observant, used that weakness like a scalpel. At this point in the early 2000s, his network isn't just moving cocaine, it's also moving loyalty. He ensures that anyone close to his business has something to lose if the machine grinds to a halt. Some receive steady stipends, others find themselves gifted new apartments, while still others are simply too frightened to say no. You could call it generosity. You could also call it insurance. Many people still think that if the Brazilian government had cracked down on systemic port corruption earlier, his empire might never have reached such heights. So what do you think? Would earlier oversight have changed anything? From his perspective, though, these ports are the perfect stage. International shipping provides the cover he needs. A single container could hold hundreds of kilos of cocaine hidden behind layers of legal product, and nobody is inclined to pry open boxes labeled as industrial spare parts or agricultural supplies. But Beira-Mar doesn't spend much time at the docks himself. He prefers to watch from a distance, letting his lieutenants handle the logistics. There's a calculated coldness to the way he operates. He knows that the fewer people who see him, the safer he remains. Still, his fingerprints are metaphorically all over the place. Do you remember the day he first handed an envelope of cash to a dock foreman? That one transaction set off a chain of favors that reached every corner of the port. Soon, the port was humming, not just with commerce, but with an unspoken awareness that Fernandinho Beira-Mar was a man you didn't cross. And the ports aren't just places of departure. they're also funnels through which product can be quietly pulled back in from international suppliers. Colombian shipments arrive under cover of night, tucked inside containers filled with legitimate goods. It's all one giant choreography, and he's the silent conductor. At the heart of it all is a paradox. He thrives by being invisible. While other criminals of the era flaunt their wealth, drawing attention like moths to a flame, Beira-Mar remains a ghost. He's the man on the street corner who blends into the crowd, the one who nods politely to security guards on his way through. And that, ironically, makes him more powerful than those who crave notoriety. One joke his men pass around is that Beira-Mar could walk past a police checkpoint carrying a duffel bag of cash, and nobody would think twice. He'd smile, nod, and move on, and the officers would remember him as just another dockside businessman. It's not entirely untrue. By 2002, Brazil's ports are not just trade hubs. They are arteries feeding Beira-Mar's growing empire. He understands that cocaine isn't simply about moving product from point A to B. It's about controlling the routes, the people, and the money flow that keep the system alive. And yet, he remains careful. He knows that the same docks that allow him to move drugs undetected are also magnets for federal investigations. Interpol has begun to raise eyebrows at Brazil's export numbers, and rumors swirl that foreign agencies are asking questions about certain irregularities. But for now, Beira-Mar's operation is humming, and he intends to keep it that way. The cranes continue lifting containers into place as the sun climbs higher over Rio. Dock workers sip coffee from paper cups, trying not to meet each other's eyes too long. Somewhere, a foreman tucks a thick envelope into his jacket and walks away from a stack of containers marked for Europe. Inside those containers is a fortune in powder, invisible to the untrained eye. And Beira-Mar? He's already planning his next move, because he knows the real key to survival is always staying 2 steps ahead. Beira-Mar's story stretches back far beyond those bustling docks. Before he became a ghost in the ports, before his name was whispered in Rio's underworld like a cautionary tale, he was simply Luis Fernando da Costa, a street-smart kid from Duque de Caxias. This working-class suburb of Rio de Janeiro was a place where children learned quickly how to fend for themselves. You could smell the sharp tang of exhaust from rusting buses, hear the constant crackle of radios blaring samba and soccer scores, and see the narrow streets lined with concrete homes painted in bright colors, fading under the relentless sun. Duque de Caxias wasn't the worst place in Brazil, but it wasn't easy. Jobs were scarce, and the distance between the wealthy neighborhoods of Rio proper and the hardscrabble outskirts felt like more than just miles. It was a world apart. Beira-Mar grew up in that environment, shaped by the realities of poverty. He learned early on that he couldn't depend on anyone else for survival. It's said that by the age of 10, he could already navigate the labyrinth of alleyways like a seasoned courier, darting through shortcuts that only the locals knew. One mainstream historical fact that many forget: Duque de Caxias, during the late 1970s and early 1980s, had some of the highest youth unemployment rates in Rio State. That kind of economic instability created a pipeline straight into the informal economy. Small thefts, street markets dealing in counterfeit goods, and eventually, drug sales became inevitable options for survival. As a teenager, Beira-Mar wasn't the type to seek attention. He was quiet, observant, the kind of kid who noticed which police officers could be bribed with a carton of cigarettes and which street vendors had the best gossip. He also saw how older boys driving shiny motorcycles seemed to command respect and fear, and he connected the dots quickly. Money brought freedom, and in Duke de Caxias, the quickest money came from the drug trade. By 16, he had already begun dabbling in small-time hustles, selling marijuana, ferrying packages across the neighborhood for cash, and occasionally acting as a lookout for older dealers. These were the low-level tasks that didn't seem like much at the time, but each one gave him a crash course in the mechanics of street crime. Many people still think that if he had been offered better opportunities, he might have chosen a different path. After all, some of his classmates went on to legitimate jobs as mechanics or shopkeepers. So, what do you think? Was it circumstance alone that steered Beira-Mar toward the underworld? Or was there something innate, an ambition too large for his environment to contain? What's clear is that he excelled at learning the rules of survival. He avoided unnecessary conflicts, choosing instead to observe patterns and strike only when it was safe. If an argument broke out in the neighborhood, he'd slip away unnoticed. If a police raid swept through the streets, he knew exactly where to hide. And as he grew older, he began to notice the gaps in the system. The drug trade wasn't just about selling, it was about logistics. Where did the product come from? Who transported it? Who paid whom to keep quiet? He started asking those questions quietly, and people began to notice. By his late teens, Beira-Mar had caught the attention of more established figures in the local scene. He was reliable, level-headed, and ambitious without being reckless. One older dealer reportedly said, "That boy doesn't waste words, but he sees everything." Around this time, the nickname Beira-Mar started to stick. It means by the sea in Portuguese, a nod perhaps to his early work near the ports, or simply a reference to how he seemed always on the edges of things, watching like the tide creeping in silently. One joke his friends told was that he was the type who could sneak into a party, eat all the food, and slip out before anyone noticed. That understated presence would become his greatest asset later, but as a young man, it was simply how he operated. His first real step up the ladder came when he made contact with Colombian suppliers through intermediaries. Small deals at first, just a few kilos of cocaine tucked into false bottom crates, but enough to build credibility. The connections were fragile, like spider webs stretching across borders, but Beira-Mar handled them with care. By the time he was in his early 20s, he was no longer just a neighborhood dealer. He was a node in a larger network, someone who could source product at competitive prices and move it efficiently. And he did it all without drawing attention to himself. Do you remember the day he first handled a Colombian shipment? He was nervous, but he didn't show it. The packages were delivered in a battered van, each brick wrapped so tightly it looked like polished stone. He knew, even then, that this was a turning point. The stakes had just risen, and mistakes would now be fatal. But he didn't make mistakes, not yet. The first Colombian shipment had gone smoothly, almost too smoothly, and that success emboldened Beira-Mar to step deeper into waters where few young men from Duke de Caxias ever ventured. Each deal now felt like walking across a bridge made of thin glass, the cracks invisible until it was too late. But Beira-Mar was deliberate. He studied every connection, every handshake, every middleman who passed product from one set of hands to the next. He had learned by then that control didn't just mean holding territory. It meant understanding the entire chain of movement. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Colombia's drug cartels were at their peak, and Brazilian ports offered the perfect southward route for distribution. Cocaine from Medellin and Cali could move by land into Brazil, then sail quietly through the busy container terminals of Rio or Santos and disappear into the international market. Beira-Mar's job was simple on paper: receive, hide, and export. But in reality, it required a delicate balance. Historical fact: Brazil's border with Colombia stretches for over 1,000 miles, most of it dense Amazon rainforest. This geography made the region almost impossible for authorities to police effectively. For traffickers, it was paradise. Remote airstrips and jungle rivers became lifelines for the product, and Beira-Mar's emerging network capitalized on this natural advantage. He developed a reputation for being calm under pressure. If a shipment was delayed, he didn't panic. If a police checkpoint appeared where it hadn't been before, he didn't force the delivery through. He waited. This patience set him apart from many of his contemporaries, who often let greed push them into reckless decisions. One of his early Colombian contacts, a man known simply as El Mono, remarked once that Beira-Mar had the eyes of someone who's already planned 3 exits before the first shot is fired. That kind of strategic thinking earned him trust. Trust led to larger shipments, and larger shipments meant more money than he had ever dreamed possible as a boy running errands in Duque de Caxias. But money brought problems. Brazilian police were already struggling to control the explosion of narcotics moving through Rio's favelas, and they knew someone was supplying the ever-growing demand. Beira-Mar kept his head down, but he couldn't completely avoid scrutiny. Occasionally, officers would raid a warehouse linked to his operation and seize a few kilos, making headlines in the local paper. These losses hurt, but they were manageable. The real danger came from betrayal, and Beira-Mar knew it. To protect himself, he built layers. Couriers never met suppliers. Street-level dealers didn't know where the product came from. Warehouse managers never saw Beira-Mar in person. Instructions were passed through trusted intermediaries. Many people still think that this compartmentalized structure was why he managed to avoid major arrest for so long. So what do you think? Did his system of secrecy make him untouchable? Or was it just luck? By now, he had begun to experiment with using the ports themselves as staging grounds. Containers filled with legitimate goods provided perfect camouflage. One crate of machine parts, destined for Europe, might have 50 kilos of cocaine wedged deep inside. Another, labeled as frozen fish, might hold twice that amount. Customs officials inspecting thousands of containers a day rarely had time or the incentive to dig too deeply. Beira-Mar's focus wasn't only on logistics, though. He also understood that loyalty was currency. Dock workers, warehouse staff, and even some police officers discovered that quiet cooperation could be very profitable. A single night's work turning a blind eye might earn more than a month's salary. But even as he grew richer, Beira-Mar refused to live like the wealthy traffickers who flashed their success. No neon-lit mansions or ostentatious parties. He dressed simply, drove unremarkable cars, and kept his personal life shielded. Some joked that he was so invisible you'd think he was allergic to sunlight. He preferred it that way. Do you remember the first time he used the port of Santos for a major export? It was a test run, a modest 20 kilos hidden in a shipment of soybeans. He barely slept that week, but when the call came from his contact overseas confirming delivery, he allowed himself a rare smile. That shipment opened doors to international buyers willing to pay premium prices for consistent, reliable supply. The money flowed faster now. With it came new challenges: rival factions seeking to muscle in, street-level violence drawing police attention, and the constant risk that someone, somewhere, might slip up and unravel the whole operation. Yet Beira-Mar thrived in that tension. He was disciplined, almost obsessive, about maintaining order. If one warehouse got too much traffic, he shut it down and moved elsewhere. If a courier became careless, he was replaced quietly, without fanfare. The international shipments kept scaling up. Colombian suppliers trusted him more with each delivery. The docks buzzed with activity as legitimate commerce masked the quiet smuggling that had made Beira-Mar one of the most important players in Brazil's growing cocaine trade. It wasn't about greed. At least, that's what he told himself. It was about building something durable, something that couldn't be swept away by a single raid or arrest. And for now, it seemed to be working. Corruption was the oil in the gears, and Beira-Mar knew how to keep the machinery running smoothly. By the mid-1990s, his growing empire thrived not only because of clever smuggling strategies, but because so many people at critical choke points simply chose not to see what was happening. Police, customs officers, dock foremen. Everyone had a price, and Beira-Mar was a master at paying just enough to ensure silence. Brazil's ports were bustling, teeming with containers, vessels, and workers. Each day, thousands of tons of cargo moved through Rio de Janeiro and Santos, and there was no way authorities could examine every shipment. A smart man could use that chaos to his advantage, and Beira-Mar was very smart. He understood that a single missed container might be a fluke, but repeated missed containers meant someone was intentionally looking the other way. He started small. Early in his career, he slipped envelopes of cash into the hands of port security. "Buy something nice for your family," he'd say casually, as though it was nothing. Later, the payments grew larger and more systematic. Some dock workers were placed on a steady stipend, paid monthly as if they were employees of an invisible company. Others received lump sums when a particularly important shipment had to pass uninspected. Historical fact. During this period, several investigations by Brazilian federal authorities revealed systemic bribery within the customs departments at major ports, particularly Rio and Santos. These investigations rarely led to long-term reforms, and many people still think that if the system had been less corruptible, traffickers like Beira-Mar would have been far easier to stop. So what do you think? Could Brazil's government have realistically closed those gaps? Or were the ports simply too vast to control? The web of bribery expanded beyond the ports. Police precincts responsible for patrolling the favelas found themselves subtly persuaded to focus their attention elsewhere. Politicians running for local office received mysterious campaign contributions. Suddenly, laws and policies seemed to tilt ever so slightly in favor of the status quo. One officer, years later, described how the bribery worked. It wasn't just cash. Sometimes it was a job for a relative, a promise of protection, or a little help paying off debts. It was never just about the money. It was about creating dependency. Beira-Mar understood this better than anyone. By making sure his people felt indebted, he turned them into shields protecting his operation from within the very institutions meant to dismantle it. Even as his power grew, he never became complacent. He monitored the flow of bribes like an accountant checks receipts. If a single police officer seemed unusually curious, that officer might suddenly find himself reassigned to another district. If a customs agent's lifestyle became suspiciously lavish, Beira-Mar would quietly cut ties, fearing the attention could ripple back to him. Do you remember the time a port inspector refused a bribe? It was an anomaly, but Beira-Mar didn't panic. He let the shipment sit, withdrew it quietly, and redirected the cargo through another route a month later. It was a lesson in patience, Never push too hard on someone you can't control. The effect of this carefully curated corruption was striking. Cocaine moved through Brazilian ports with clockwork precision. Containers full of coffee beans, leather goods, and machinery all bore his invisible fingerprints, slipping onto freighters bound for Europe, Africa, and the United States. Each successful shipment strengthened his reputation, not just in Brazil, but across the international drug trade. But with success came new challenges. Rivals noticed how smoothly Beira-Mar's operation ran. They wanted a piece of it. And when competitors couldn't muscle in directly, they sometimes tipped off police in the hopes of disrupting his network. Beira-Mar responded by tightening his circle even further. Few people saw him in person now. Instructions were relayed through layers of lieutenants, and meetings were rare, always held in places where escape routes were plentiful. His men joked that he was like a ghost, always present but never visible. And in a way, it was true. While other traffickers flaunted their wealth with parties and luxury cars, Beira-Mar seemed to melt into the background. He could attend a meeting at a crowded cafe and blend in with everyone else, his face unremarkable, his manner calm. Yet even in this invisibility, he wielded enormous power. One phone call from him could halt operations at a port or divert a shipment halfway across the continent. He was the unseen conductor of an orchestra playing at full volume, and everyone in the underworld knew it. Still, there was a quiet tension building. The favelas he relied on for manpower were becoming increasingly militarized. Police raids grew more aggressive, and political pressure to crack down on the drug trade was mounting. Beira-Mar sensed the shift, but he believed his network of corruption could weather the storm. It was a gamble, and like all gambles, it depended on maintaining control over variables he couldn't fully predict. The favelas were more than just urban sprawl on Rio's hillsides. They were the backbone of Beira-Mar's operation. By the late 1990s, the labyrinthine alleys and steep staircases of these communities had become fortified strongholds where his network operated with near impunity. Here, amid the tangle of brick homes and improvised electrical lines, his crews worked like a paramilitary force, ready to defend the territory that fed their families and their futures. Beira-Mar understood early that loyalty could not be demanded. It had to be built. In neighborhoods where government presence was sporadic and services nearly non-existent, he stepped into the vacuum. Food baskets appeared at doorsteps. Community centers were repaired. Families struggling to pay medical bills found envelopes of cash slipped under their doors. These gestures weren't entirely altruistic, but they were effective. Residents who might otherwise resent the presence of drug traffickers came to see Beira-Mar as a provider in a way the state never had been. Historical fact. During the 1990s, many Brazilian favelas were effectively governed by drug factions. Police patrols rarely entered without heavy backup, and traffickers often enforced their own codes of conduct to maintain order. This parallel system of governance made dismantling these groups exceedingly difficult. Beira-Mar's lieutenants enforced rules designed to keep the neighborhoods relatively stable. Petty theft was forbidden. Violence had to be sanctioned. Any action that drew unnecessary attention from the authorities was swiftly punished. Many people still think that this order was one of the reasons the community tolerated his presence. So, what do you think? Was it pragmatic acceptance? Or did people truly believe he was doing good? From his perspective, the arrangement was simple. As long as the community saw benefits, they were less likely to betray him. Children carried messages through the alleys. Women served as lookouts, their laundry lines doubling as signals when police approached. Teenagers with radios perched on rooftops provided a constant stream of intelligence. It was a network as intricate as any corporate security system, and it made infiltrating his operations nearly impossible. Do you remember the story of the time federal police attempted a surprise raid in one of these favelas? Before the first officers had even entered the neighborhood, Beira-Mar's lookouts had already sounded the alarm. Within minutes, stash houses were emptied, weapons were hidden, and key lieutenants had vanished through secret passages connecting the homes. The raid turned up nothing, and the officers left frustrated. Their credibility diminished. This sense of invincibility began to define Beira-Mar's presence in the favelas. He rarely visited them personally by this point. His face was too valuable to risk exposure. But when he did, it was with calculated purpose. He would walk through the alleys unarmed, greeting residents like an unassuming neighbor. These appearances reinforced the myth of his untouchability, yet beneath the calm surface, tension simmered. Rival gangs coveted his strongholds and the profits they generated. Gun battles occasionally erupted, echoing through the hills like thunder. Beira-Mar dealt with these threats methodically. He dispatched seasoned enforcers to quash uprisings and offered alliances to factions willing to fall in line. Violence was always a last resort, but when it came, it was decisive. His ability to maintain control without descending into chaos impressed even his adversaries. One rival leader reportedly told an associate, "Beira-Mar isn't just a trafficker, he's a strategist. He treats these neighborhoods like kingdoms." But the favelas were more than just defensive outposts. They were staging areas for distribution, storage, and recruitment. Young men, drawn by the promise of money and status, joined his ranks in droves. They started as lookouts or couriers, and, if they proved themselves, rose through the hierarchy. The media, meanwhile, had begun to paint Beira-Mar as a shadowy figure, pulling strings from the safety of his fortified communities. News segments showed aerial footage of the favelas, their narrow streets impossible for armored vehicles to navigate. Commentators debated whether these areas were beyond the reach of the state. Beira-Mar watched these reports with a detached curiosity. He knew that as long as the favelas remained his strongholds, his empire could endure raids at the ports, arrests of mid-level operators, even temporary disruptions in supply. The communities were his insurance policy. Still, he recognized the danger of becoming complacent. He instructed his men to avoid unnecessary confrontations with police and to keep violence contained. Drawing too much public attention could provoke political leaders to commit more resources to dismantling his organization. But for now, the balance held. The favelas thrived under his shadow. The ports hummed with illicit shipments, and Beira-Mar remained a phantom presence, respected and feared in equal measure. And in the quiet moments, when he allowed himself to think beyond the day-to-day logistics, he wondered how long the system could hold before the cracks began to show. The ports and favelas gave Beira-Mar a formidable base, but it was the rivers of the Amazon that would unlock the next phase of his empire. In the mid to late 1990s, he began experimenting with a new smuggling route, one that threaded through Brazil's vast and nearly unpoliced waterways. The idea was as simple as it was brilliant. Move cocaine through the same tributaries that indigenous communities had used for centuries, bypassing the heavily monitored highways and airports altogether. The Amazon River Basin is the size of a continent in itself. Its dense canopy can swallow entire villages from view, and its countless tributaries stretch across international borders like veins. Historical fact: Brazil's Amazonian borderlands are some of the most porous in the world. With few roads and limited federal presence, it's an ideal environment for contraband of any kind. Beira-Mar knew this, and he intended to exploit it. He began quietly funding small flotillas of fishing boats, each capable of navigating the narrow channels of the upper Amazon. These vessels looked harmless, crewed by men who appeared to be ordinary fishermen. But hidden under layers of bait and tarps were tightly wrapped bricks of cocaine. The boats could travel from Colombia and Peru into Brazil, stopping at remote waypoints where the product was consolidated before heading toward the ports. It was a logistical masterpiece. Local communities along the river were drawn into the operation with promises of steady work and generous payments. Beira-Mar was careful to balance fear and reward, ensuring that his presence was seen as beneficial, or at least inevitable. Many people still think that the Amazonian route was what made him untouchable for so long. So, what do you think? Would traditional law enforcement methods ever have been enough to stop a network that spanned thousands of miles of jungle and river? Do you remember the first major shipment to travel this way? It left Colombia under the cover of darkness, its boats gliding silently through black water. Beira-Mar's men coordinated by shortwave radio, speaking in code. The entire journey took 2 weeks, with multiple handoffs at hidden river docks. When the cocaine finally reached the port of Rio, it was already pre-sold to European buyers. The profits from that single operation dwarfed what Beira-Mar had been making through his previous routes. The Amazon experiment proved so successful that he scaled it up immediately. He invested in faster boats, hired skilled navigators familiar with the currents, and even purchased remote properties along the riverbanks to serve as staging areas. He also began exploring new technology. Lightweight satellite phones, still rare at the time, allowed him to coordinate with his lieutenants in real time. But the jungle held dangers that went beyond law enforcement. River pirates, rival traffickers, and unpredictable weather could all derail a shipment. One infamous incident saw a convoy of 3 boats ambushed near the Brazilian-Peruvian border. 2 boats escaped, but one was seized, and its crew was never heard from again. Beira-Mar was furious, but he didn't allow emotion to cloud his judgment. He simply reworked the system to make future ambushes less likely. The jungle route also required building alliances with other criminal groups, particularly the Colombian suppliers who controlled much of the upstream flow. This led Beira-Mar into contact with the FARC guerrillas, who were financing their insurgency through the drug trade. At first, the relationship was purely transactional. FARC needed weapons and supplies. Beira-Mar could provide them. In return, the guerrillas ensured his shipments moved safely through their territory. These arrangements were never formalized with handshakes or contracts, just quiet understandings reinforced by mutual profit. By now, Beira-Mar's organization was functioning like a multinational company. There were logistics divisions, the river routes and ports, security teams, favela-based crews and armed escorts, and financial arms, offshore accounts and money laundering fronts. And at the top sat Beira-Mar himself, invisible but omnipresent. Despite the increasing complexity of the operation, he maintained his trademark discipline. He refused to let greed dictate decisions. If a route became too hot, he abandoned it. If a shipment was lost, he treated it as a cost of doing business rather than a reason for retaliation. This level-headed approach kept him alive in an industry where emotion often led to bullets. Still, he was aware of the growing attention his activities were drawing. Brazilian federal police had begun mapping out his network, and international agencies like Interpol and the DEA were quietly taking notice. But even as the scrutiny increased, Beira-Mar's jungle pipeline hummed with activity, ferrying cocaine from the Andes to the Atlantic with remarkable efficiency. In the quiet moments, as he reviewed reports from his lieutenants, he allowed himself to marvel at what he had built. He had taken the lessons of Duke de Caxias, the need to stay unseen, the value of loyalty, the art of patience, and applied them to a network that now spanned entire countries. But he also knew that with each success, the stakes grew higher. The jungle route was flowing with product and profit, but Beira-Mar faced a challenge as old as the trade itself: how to clean the money. You can't walk into a bank and deposit millions in cash without raising questions, and stacks of Brazilian reals don't spend easily outside the country. The answer, as always, lay in building front companies, businesses that looked legitimate enough to handle large transactions while hiding the true source of the funds. Fishing fleets were his first solution. Beira-Mar began quietly acquiring small companies that operated along Brazil's northern and northeastern coasts. These outfits owned boats, paid crews, bought fuel, and sold seafood to markets across the country. On paper, their profits came from hauling in tons of fish. In reality, the books were inflated, and the catch often included tightly wrapped bricks of cocaine tucked under ice. Historical fact: Brazil's fishing industry has long been loosely regulated, with cash-heavy transactions and few standardized tracking systems. This made it ideal for laundering illicit money. By blending illegal profits with the real sales of fish, shrimp, and crab, traffickers could move millions without raising alarms. Beira-Mar's accountants were meticulous. Each front company maintained detailed ledgers, falsified invoices, and plausible profit margins. He employed legitimate managers alongside his loyal lieutenants, ensuring that no one piece of the puzzle could be easily connected back to him. These layers insulated him from exposure. If one company was ever investigated, it would simply look like a struggling fishing business with messy paperwork. Do you remember the time one of these fleets was raided by federal police? The inspectors found nothing but fish in a tangle of nets. Beira-Mar had moved the cocaine out days earlier after a lookout tipped him off. The raid made headlines, but it only reinforced the myth of his invulnerability. As his money laundering system matured, Beira-Mar diversified further. He bought real estate, apartment complexes, warehouses, even beachfront properties, always through intermediaries and shell corporations. He invested in import-export companies, car dealerships, and nightclubs, not because he craved the nightlife, but because the businesses provided convenient cover for large cash infusions. Many people still think that Beira-Mar's ability to launder money so effectively is what allowed him to rival the great cartels of Colombia and Mexico. So, what do you think? Was he simply lucky to find so many exploitable industries, or was his success the result of a brilliant financial mind? Offshore banking became another pillar of the empire. Beira-Mar's lawyers set up shell corporations in Panama, Antigua, and other Caribbean havens, places where banking secrecy laws made it nearly impossible for authorities to trace ownership. These accounts became vaults for the profits of each successful shipment. The money moved invisibly across borders, just like the product itself. His fishing fleets also played another role: smuggling. Cocaine was hidden not only in containers passing through the big ports, but also in smaller boats that could slip into remote inlets and unload cargo directly to waiting buyers. Beira-Mar's crews became adept at timing their arrivals to coincide with poor weather, when patrol boats were less likely to be out. One of his lieutenants later said, "We didn't just move cocaine, we moved opportunity. Every port, every company, every bank account was a piece of the same puzzle, but with growth came new vulnerabilities." Larger shipments required more people, and more people meant a greater risk of leaks. Beira-Mar's paranoia, never far beneath the surface, began to grow. He instituted regular loyalty tests, planting false information with subordinates to see if it would surface with the police. Those who failed the test were quietly removed from the organization. Despite this tightening grip, he remained careful never to appear directly connected to the money. His lifestyle, though comfortable, was modest compared to many traffickers. He didn't own flashy sports cars or private jets. He didn't throw lavish parties. This restraint made it difficult for investigators to point to him as the kingpin behind the operation. Do you remember the time journalists tried to photograph his house? They expected a mansion, but what they found was a simple, unremarkable home behind a high wall. It looked more like the residence of a middle-class businessman than the headquarters of one of Brazil's most powerful traffickers. For Beira-Mar, invisibility was power. The front companies, the fishing fleets, the real estate investments, all of it formed a shield. As long as the money flowed cleanly and the public image remained bland, he believed his empire could survive the occasional raid or arrest of a mid-level manager. But deep down, he knew this balance couldn't last forever. As Beira-Mar's operations grew more sophisticated, whispers began to drift far beyond the favelas and ports. They reached Brasilia, Brazil's capital, where the sleek marble buildings of government stood in sharp contrast to the chaotic alleys of Duque de Caxias. Politicians and their aides started hearing his name in hushed tones. They pretended not to listen, but they listened all the same. For Beira-Mar, this was both a threat and an opportunity. He understood better than most that power wasn't confined to guns and money. True power came from influence, the kind that could tilt laws in your favor, bury investigations, or open new doors entirely. And in Brazil's often turbulent political climate, campaign financing was a direct line to that influence. Historical fact: Brazil's campaign finance system in the 1990s and early 2000s was notoriously opaque, with large amounts of cash donations going largely untracked. This environment made it fertile ground for criminal organizations seeking to buy goodwill. Beira-Mar began funneling money quietly into local and regional campaigns. The contributions were never made in his name, of course. They passed through the front companies and shell corporations he had built for laundering money. Some candidates likely didn't even know the true source of the funds, but others did, and chose to look away. Do you remember the election cycle where a city council candidate suddenly had the resources to plaster his face on every billboard in Rio? Many suspected cartel money had greased that campaign, though nothing was ever proven. Beira-Mar watched from a distance as the candidate won handily. A few months later, city contracts that once caused headaches for his logistics suddenly moved through the council without objection. Many people still think that this level of political penetration was the key to his long run at the top. So what do you think? Can a kingpin survive without political cover? Or is it as essential as cash and muscle? Beira-Mar didn't just focus on politicians. He cultivated relationships with government officials at all levels. A low-ranking clerk in the customs office might find a job for her brother suddenly materialize. A police commander might receive a discreet envelope to help with unit expenses. None of these gestures were overtly criminal, but they built a network of gratitude and obligation that Beira-Mar could call on when necessary, and necessity came often. When a port inspector became too curious about container seals, a phone call from the right politician could reassign him to a different department. When federal investigators began mapping his financial network, a friendly official might warn Beira-Mar days before the raids. These quiet interventions gave him breathing room, but they also made him a target. There were elements within the federal police and the Ministry of Justice determined to dismantle his operation. Beira-Mar knew they were watching, so he adapted. Meetings with politicians became rare and were always conducted through intermediaries. Donations to campaigns were disguised with layers of bureaucracy. Do you remember the case of the state deputy whose campaign was later linked to cartel cash? He resigned in disgrace after the press uncovered the connection, but Beira-Mar's name never appeared in the reports. That was by design. He moved like a shadow, leaving no paper trail, no photographs, nothing prosecutors could use in court. Despite this caution, the rumors in Brasilia grew louder. Journalists began to speculate that Beira-Mar's network reached higher than anyone realized. Commentators asked whether certain public works contracts or city council votes were influenced by cartel money. These stories embarrassed politicians, but they also made it harder for law enforcement to gather allies. No one wanted to risk being accused of collusion by pursuing the wrong target too aggressively. Still, Beira-Mar was careful not to overplay his hand. He knew that pushing too far into politics could trigger a backlash that even his money couldn't contain. He used his influence sparingly, like a scalpel rather than a hammer. For now, the whispers in Brasilia remained just that, whispers. But Beira-Mar could feel the scrutiny sharpening. The jungle roots and political cover gave Beira-Mar unprecedented reach. But his empire was still dependent on the steady flow of product from Colombia. By the late 1990s, that pipeline became intertwined with one of South America's most formidable armed groups, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, better known as the FARC. The guerrilla army had spent decades fighting the Colombian government, financing their insurgency through the cocaine trade. For Beira-Mar, an alliance with FARC wasn't optional. It was essential. Their first meetings were tense, held in remote camps deep in the Colombian jungle, where the air was thick with humidity and the constant hum of insects. Beira-Mar traveled with only a small security detail, understanding that bringing too many men would be seen as a sign of mistrust. The FARC commanders, dressed in worn fatigues and armed to the teeth, wanted weapons and supplies in exchange for safe passage of cocaine shipments through their territory. Historical fact. During this period, the FARC controlled vast swaths of rural Colombia, taxing or outright managing coca production and using its profits to fund its insurgency. Their reach was so extensive that even Colombian military operations struggled to dislodge them from their jungle strongholds. Beira-Mar agreed to the arrangement. He could access weapons through Paraguayan black markets, and those rifles and ammunition would keep the FARC's fighters supplied. In return, his cocaine shipments could move undisturbed from coca fields to the Brazilian border. It was a partnership built on necessity, not trust. Do you remember the first arms delivery he arranged? The convoy left Paraguay disguised as a shipment of agricultural equipment. By the time it reached the Colombian jungle, its cargo had been switched out for crates of AK-47s and ammunition belts. FARC commanders examined the weapons carefully, nodding their approval. The deal cemented Beira-Mar's position as a reliable partner. Many people still think that these arms for drugs exchanges made Beira-Mar more dangerous than any other trafficker in Brazil. So what do you think? Was his alliance with the FARC a stroke of genius? Or did it tether his empire to forces beyond his control? The arrangement came with its risks. The Colombian government and international intelligence agencies were watching FARC closely. Any shipment tied too directly to the guerrillas could draw the kind of scrutiny Beira-Mar had worked his whole life to avoid. He responded by building layers of intermediaries, using freelance smugglers and brokers so that neither side could be easily linked to the other. The FARC appreciated his reliability, but they also respected his discretion. He never attended more meetings than necessary, and he rarely revealed his full network of contacts. The fewer people who knew the extent of his operations, the better. Yet even as the partnership thrived, Beira-Mar kept a wary eye on his Colombian counterparts. He understood that guerrilla armies had their own priorities, and his needs would always be secondary to their political and military goals. If the FARC ever decided that his presence was inconvenient, they could cut him off. Or worse. One joke among his men was that the FARC treated partners the way the jungle treated intruders. They could coexist for a while, but eventually, something would get swallowed. To mitigate this risk, Beira-Mar diversified his suppliers, building relationships with independent producers and other Colombian cartels. These connections ensured that if the FARC alliance soured, he wouldn't be left empty-handed. Do you remember the clandestine meeting he held with a rival Colombian cartel near the border? The two sides sat across from each other at a rickety wooden table, lantern light casting long shadows on their faces. No threats were exchanged, just quiet negotiations about price, volume, and reliability. It was the same careful balancing act Beira-Mar had perfected in every part of his operation, never putting all his eggs in one basket. For now, the FARC partnership kept his pipeline open and his profits flowing. But deep down, he knew that alliances built in the shadows could dissolve just as quickly. By the late 1990s, Beira-Mar's influence reached deep into the favelas, the ports, the Amazon, and even Colombian supply chains. But if his operations were growing, so too was the need for control. The favelas had become more than safe havens. They were miniature kingdoms where his lieutenants ruled with strict codes of conduct. Each neighborhood he controlled followed the same set of rules, and those who lived there knew that breaking them came with swift consequences. The favelas were chaotic by nature, but Beira-Mar understood that chaos attracted police attention. His lieutenants were tasked with maintaining an order that the state could not provide. Children were discouraged from joining rival gangs. Petty crime like robbery or assault within the community was forbidden. Anyone who drew attention from law enforcement was quietly removed from the streets. Historical fact: during the late 1990s, many favelas in Rio de Janeiro were essentially self-governed by drug factions. Police rarely entered without armored vehicles and heavy firepower, and even then, raids often resulted in fierce gunfights. Beira-Mar's lieutenants adopted tactics that mirrored military organization. Young men were recruited as lookouts, stationed on rooftops with radios to monitor police movements. Couriers carried messages and product through the warren of alleys, while enforcers patrolled the boundaries. When the authorities did attempt to enter, they encountered barricades and ambushes that forced them to retreat. Many people still think that this structure gave Beira-Mar's organization a level of resilience unmatched by other Brazilian traffickers. So what do you think? Can such order ever truly coexist with a criminal enterprise? Or is it just a facade? Beira-Mar rarely appeared in the favelas himself, but his presence was felt in every alley. He made sure families received basic goods, food, medicine, school supplies, to secure their loyalty. Parents who might otherwise resent the traffickers came to see them as protectors, or at least necessary evils. When someone in the community was sick or injured, it was often Beira-Mar's organization that provided transport to hospitals or cash for treatment. Do you remember the time a favela resident refused to cooperate with police? She told them flatly, "The traffickers are the only ones who help us." That kind of loyalty was priceless, and Beira-Mar knew it. The media, meanwhile, began to paint the favelas under his control as parallel states. Television helicopters hovered above during police raids, broadcasting images of gunfire flashing between the corrugated rooftops. Politicians in Brasilia decried the situation, but few offered real solutions. Beira-Mar watched these reports from a distance, knowing that public outrage rarely translated into effective action. He also used the favelas as warehouses. Safe houses hidden in plain sight stored weapons, cash, and product. Residents learned quickly not to ask questions about the homes with reinforced doors or the cars that arrived late at night, but this control came at a cost. Rivals, jealous of his growing empire, attempted to infiltrate or take over these territories. Gunfights occasionally erupted, shattering the fragile peace. Beira-Mar's lieutenants responded ruthlessly, ensuring that any challenge to their authority was crushed. The balance of power was delicate. If the violence became too visible, it risked triggering massive police crackdowns. If they were too lenient, rivals would sense weakness. Beira-Mar's ability to maintain this equilibrium was one of his greatest skills, and it required constant vigilance. Do you remember the raid in Complexo do Alemão, where police forces suffered heavy casualties and withdrew without seizing a single kilogram of cocaine? That incident became a symbol of how entrenched Beira-Mar's faction had become in Rio's favelas. By now, his name was legend. Residents spoke of him with a mix of fear and admiration. Police and politicians viewed him as a specter who always seemed to be 2 steps ahead. But even as his empire grew, he remained focused on the fundamentals, staying invisible and maintaining control at every level. And as night fell over Rio, the favelas under his shadow hummed with quiet efficiency, each alleyway and stairwell part of a system designed to keep him untouchable. While other drug bosses of the era were busy flaunting their wealth with flashy cars and extravagant parties, Beira-Mar kept himself deliberately low profile. He didn't want to be photographed in glossy magazines or whispered about in nightclubs. He preferred silence, invisibility. This wasn't humility. It was survival. He understood that the more public your lifestyle, the easier it was for law enforcement and rivals to track your movements. And in the 1990s, many of Brazil's most notorious traffickers had been brought down not by elaborate police work, but by their own ostentatious displays. Beira-Mar made a different calculation. He drove ordinary sedans instead of imported sports cars. He lived in unremarkable houses tucked behind unmarked gates. He dressed simply, avoiding the kind of attention-grabbing fashion that others loved. Historical fact: Brazil's federal police had been ramping up its intelligence operations during this period, using financial audits and surveillance to bring down drug bosses. Those who flaunted their wealth became easy targets. Many people still think that Beira-Mar's invisibility was the single most important factor in his longevity. So what do you think? Can a criminal empire survive if its leader craves fame? Do you remember the journalist who tried to track him down for a major expose? She visited the neighborhoods where he was rumored to live, only to find that no one could even describe him clearly. Some said he was tall, others short. Some claimed he had a scar on his cheek, others swore he didn't. This fog of uncertainty was by design. Instead of drawing attention to himself, Beira-Mar invested in people. He surrounded himself with lieutenants who understood his values: discretion, efficiency, and loyalty. These men handled the public-facing parts of the business, allowing him to remain a ghost. The police were often left chasing shadows. They might intercept a shipment or arrest a mid-level manager, but the arrests rarely led back to Beira-Mar himself. He used burner phones, met lieutenants only in secure locations, and never kept incriminating documents. If a safe house was compromised, he abandoned it without hesitation, preferring to lose property rather than risk exposure. This low-profile strategy extended to his finances. While his front companies and shell corporations moved millions through offshore accounts, Beira-Mar himself never appeared on any paperwork. He avoided anything that could create a paper trail. No flashy credit card purchases, no deeds in his own name, no social media accounts, which by the early 2000s were beginning to ensnare the careless. There was even a rumor among law enforcement that Beira-Mar didn't own a single personal cell phone. Instead, he borrowed phones from his lieutenants when he needed to make a call, discarding the device afterward. Whether or not that was true, it added to his mythos. His invisibility made him seem almost untouchable. Rivals couldn't find him, and law enforcement couldn't pin him down. He became the phantom at the center of Brazil's cocaine trade, directing operations without leaving fingerprints. Do you remember the time a police task force raided a luxury condo in Rio, convinced they would find him there? They burst through the door only to discover an empty apartment, its fridge stocked, its closets full of clothes, as though someone had left moments before. Investigators believed he had been tipped off and slipped away through a service exit. But this invisibility wasn't just about avoiding capture. It was also a way to maintain control over his organization. By keeping himself distant from daily operations, Beira-Mar ensured that no one could claim they knew everything about his business. Even his most trusted lieutenants only understood fragments. This compartmentalization was his safety net. If one part of the network was compromised, the rest could survive. It also meant that betrayal was harder. No single person could hand over enough information to dismantle the entire empire. As he looked at the growing map of his operations, favelas, ports, jungle routes, Colombian suppliers, offshore accounts, Beira-Mar knew that staying invisible was the only way to hold it all together, and so, while others chased fame, he chose the shadows, where no camera could capture his face, and no microphone could record his voice. As his empire matured, Beira-Mar turned his attention to one of the most lucrative yet dangerous parts of the business, the arms markets in Paraguay. The small, landlocked country, wedged between Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia, had long been a hub for contraband. Lax regulations, corruptible officials, and porous borders made it an ideal source of weapons for anyone who could pay. Beira-Mar understood that control over guns meant control over territory. His crews in the favelas needed more than makeshift pistols to repel police raids or rivals. They needed rifles, shotguns, and ammunition in bulk, and the Paraguayan black markets, particularly in the chaotic border city of Ciudad del Este, offered exactly that. Historical fact: Ciudad del Este has been known for decades as a smuggling capital, with bustling markets selling everything from counterfeit electronics to military-grade weapons. Criminal groups from across South America have sourced arms there, exploiting weak oversight and abundant supply. Beira-Mar began sending trusted lieutenants to Paraguay with suitcases of cash. The weapons they purchased were transported back into Brazil through hidden routes, often disguised as shipments of household goods or agricultural supplies. Once the crates reached the favelas, they were distributed to his security teams, ensuring that his organization could match or even outgun law enforcement during confrontations. Do you remember the first shipment that came back from Paraguay? It was a mix of AK-47s and FN/FAL rifles, the kind used by military forces, carefully wrapped in plastic and packed inside crates labeled as farm machinery. That shipment changed the balance of power in the favelas overnight. Many people still think that Beira-Mar's access to these weapons made him one of the most dangerous men in Brazil. So what do you think? Could his network have grown so vast without this firepower behind it? The Paraguayan arms trade also gave Beira-Mar leverage with his Colombian partners. FARC needed weapons just as badly as cocaine buyers needed product, and Beira-Mar's ability to source and deliver arms strengthened their alliance. He could offer rifles, grenades, and ammunition at prices lower than the international black market, further cementing his role as a key intermediary in the drug-for-guns exchange. But this expansion carried new risks. Paraguay's border regions were crawling with rival traffickers, each vying for control of the same smuggling routes. One of Beira-Mar's convoys was ambushed on a return trip, resulting in the loss of several men and a shipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Beira-Mar's response was swift and surgical. The attackers were identified and eliminated, sending a clear message to anyone considering interference. Do you remember the story of how he personally approved a retaliation strike in a border town bar? It was rare for him to involve himself in tactical decisions, but he made an exception here. The retaliation was brutal and effective, restoring his group's dominance in the region. Even so, Beira-Mar remained cautious. He knew that the arms market was a magnet for law enforcement, particularly international agencies concerned about weapons flowing into terrorist groups. He implemented the same compartmentalization he used elsewhere. Different teams handled purchases, transportation, and distribution, ensuring no one person could expose the entire operation. By now, his network spanned multiple countries, with assets and alliances stretching from the jungles of Colombia to the streets of Rio, from Caribbean banks to Paraguayan markets. And yet, Beira-Mar himself remained a shadow, rarely appearing in person, always a step removed from the violence and logistics that powered his empire. But he wasn't blind to the growing pressure. Brazilian federal police, increasingly frustrated by their inability to catch him, were forming new task forces. International agencies like the DEA and Interpol were beginning to coordinate with Brazilian authorities, sharing intelligence about his movements and shipments. For now, Beira-Mar's low profile and complex network kept him insulated. But he knew that the more successful his empire became, the more determined his enemies would be to dismantle it. And he also knew that one betrayal could undo everything. Betrayal was the one variable Beira-Mar could never fully control. He had built his empire on loyalty, but loyalty in the underworld was a fragile commodity. One miscalculation, one desperate man seeking to save himself, and years of meticulous planning could unravel overnight. It was a close ally who broke the spell. This man had been with Beira-Mar since the early days, a trusted lieutenant who handled shipments and payouts with quiet competence. He was the type who seemed immune to pressure, until the day he wasn't. A raid on a safe house went wrong, and the lieutenant was cornered with evidence that could send him to prison for life. Facing the full weight of federal charges, he made a choice. Historical fact: Brazilian law at the time allowed for plea bargains in exchange for cooperation, and prosecutors had begun using this tool aggressively against organized crime. The lieutenant's cooperation wasn't immediate. At first, he fed investigators small pieces of information: addresses of low-level couriers, details about stash houses that had already been emptied. But the police weren't fooled. They wanted the big prize, and they made it clear that his only path to freedom was to bring them closer to Beira-Mar himself. Do you remember the first shipment that was intercepted as a result? It was a container disguised as a shipment of hardwood lumber, packed with 80 kilos of cocaine. The seizure made headlines, and Beira-Mar knew instantly that someone had betrayed him. He quietly ordered an internal audit of every contact, every transaction. Many people still think that the way Beira-Mar handled this betrayal shows his cold, strategic nature. So what do you think? Should he have cut ties sooner? Or was it inevitable that someone so close would eventually turn when the evidence became undeniable? He acted. The lieutenant vanished one night after a meeting in the favelas. Some whispered that his body was buried deep in the Amazon, where no one would ever find it. Others believed he was executed in a warehouse near the docks. Whatever the truth, the message was clear. Betrayal would not be tolerated, but the damage had already been done. The police now had a partial map of his network, and they were eager to exploit it. Raids on stash houses increased. Mid-level managers were arrested and interrogated. Some cracked under pressure, giving up pieces of information that investigators stitched together like a patchwork quilt. Beira-Mar responded by tightening his security protocols even further. He rotated meeting locations constantly, never using the same safe house twice. Couriers changed phone numbers weekly, and communication was limited to prearranged codes. Any weak links were severed without hesitation. Do you remember the story of the courier who failed a loyalty test? He had been fed false information about a shipment, and when police intercepted it, Beira-Mar knew the leak had come from him. The man disappeared within 24 hours. This climate of fear kept most of his people in line, but it also bred paranoia. Beira-Mar trusted fewer and fewer individuals, relying heavily on a small inner circle whose loyalty was beyond question. Or so he hoped. The betrayal also hardened him. He became more calculating, less willing to take risks. Where he might once have pushed forward aggressively, he now paused to assess every angle. Some of his lieutenants grumbled about his caution, but they understood that survival depended on patience. Meanwhile, law enforcement celebrated each minor victory, even though they were still far from capturing the man at the top. The media portrayed Beira-Mar as a phantom, always slipping through the fingers of those who pursued him, but he knew the walls were closing in. One betrayal had given his enemies a foothold. Another could bring the entire empire crashing down. Betrayal had shaken Beira-Mar's network, but he was not about to let fear destroy what he had built. Instead, he doubled down on his strategy of buying goodwill in the communities that served as the lifeblood of his empire. He had always understood the importance of perception, and now, more than ever, he needed the people of the favelas and port neighborhoods to view him as a benefactor rather than a predator. The solution was community projects, schools, clinics, food programs, and sponsorships for youth activities. On the surface, these initiatives looked charitable, even noble. Children received free uniforms for soccer clubs. Pregnant mothers were given access to doctors who otherwise wouldn't set foot in the favelas, and families struggling to feed themselves found bags of groceries waiting at their doors. Historical fact: many Brazilian traffickers during the 1990s and early 2000s engaged in parallel social work as a way of building community support. This tactic made it difficult for police to secure cooperation from residents, who often depended on traffickers for basic needs. Beira-Mar's efforts followed this pattern, but on a larger scale. He invested heavily in visible improvements, repairing roads, painting community centers, and even paying for funerals. His lieutenants were instructed to treat residents with respect and to resolve disputes peacefully whenever possible. Many people still think that these projects were purely self-serving, designed to create a shield of loyalty. So, what do you think? Can acts of generosity from someone like Beira-Mar ever be considered genuine? Or are they just another form of control? Do you remember the story of the woman whose house burned down in one of Rio's hillside favelas? Within days, Beira-Mar's men had rebuilt it, complete with new furniture. When the police later questioned her about cartel activities, she refused to say a word. These gestures paid dividends. Residents who might otherwise have cooperated with law enforcement chose silence instead. Some even actively misled investigators, sending them down false trails to protect Beira-Mar's organization. But the community projects were more than just a defensive tactic. They also served as a kind of moral camouflage. Journalists and politicians who might have criticized Beira-Mar found themselves confronted with images of smiling children attending schools he had funded. The narrative shifted subtly. Was he a ruthless kingpin, or a kind of Robin Hood figure filling the void left by a negligent government? Do you remember the documentary crew that tried to film in one of his strongholds? They found freshly painted playgrounds and murals honoring community leaders, but little evidence of the drug trade. Residents spoke warmly about the people who helped us, and the filmmakers left with more questions than answers. These projects also strengthened Beira-Mar's control over his lieutenants. By tying them into visible community improvements, he gave them a stake in the organization's public image. They understood that any reckless act could undo the goodwill that had been so carefully cultivated. Yet even as he built this facade of benevolence, Beira-Mar never lost sight of the larger goal, protecting his empire from the increasing pressure of law enforcement. Every school built and every grocery bag delivered was another thread in a web designed to keep the police at bay, and for a while, it worked. Investigators found it nearly impossible to penetrate neighborhoods where Beira-Mar's projects had taken root. Residents would warn his men at the first sign of a raid, and any stranger asking too many questions was immediately suspected of being an informant. But Beira-Mar knew that goodwill had limits. If the police ever managed to disrupt the flow of money and supplies, the same communities that adored him could turn on him just as quickly. So he kept building, kept giving, kept weaving the narrative that he was not just a trafficker, but a protector. And as he stood in the shadows, watching children play on a field his money had cleared and leveled, he understood the paradox. His survival depended not only on fear, but on faith. The Brazilian media had been circling for months, piecing together fragments of information about a mysterious figure whose influence seemed to stretch from Rio's ports to the remote Amazon. By the turn of the millennium, Fernandinho Beira-Mar was no longer just a name whispered in law enforcement briefings. He was becoming a public figure, albeit one defined by headlines rather than photographs. News outlets ran exposés with grainy images of men they claimed were his lieutenants. Journalists traced the flow of weapons and cocaine through ports and favelas, pointing to a mastermind pulling the strings. Yet no one had a clear image of the man himself. Some reports described him as tall and lean. Others said he was of average height, blending seamlessly into a crowd. This uncertainty only fueled the mystique. Historical fact: Brazilian television networks during the early 2000s were increasingly invested in sensational crime coverage. This media focus often amplified the notoriety of drug traffickers, inadvertently elevating their profiles. Beira-Mar, true to form, remained calm. He didn't crave the spotlight, and he certainly didn't panic at the press coverage. In his mind, the media was both a risk and a tool. On the one hand, heightened attention could provoke new law enforcement operations. On the other, the legend of Beira-Mar could deter rivals and reinforce his mythos as a ghost-like figure who could not be touched. Do you remember the documentary-style feature that aired on national television, showing aerial footage of the favelas under his control? It depicted children playing soccer in alleys, while armed lookouts stood watch on rooftops. The narrator painted a picture of neighborhoods where traffickers, not the state, held power. Beira-Mar reportedly watched the program from a safe house and chuckled. "They're telling the truth," he said, "but they're also doing my work for me." Many people still think that the media attention actually helped him in some ways. So what do you think? Does fear built through headlines protect someone like Beira-Mar, or does it ultimately draw the kind of attention he can't afford? As reporters dug deeper, politicians began to use Beira-Mar's name in speeches about law and order. Public outrage grew, and calls for a crackdown intensified. Federal police announced new task forces, and there were rumors that Interpol and the DEA were now sharing intelligence with Brazilian authorities. Yet despite this mounting pressure, Beira-Mar's network remained intact. Shipments continued to move through the ports, protected by layers of corruption. The Amazon routes carried product from Colombia to Brazil with clockwork precision. Offshore accounts remained flush with laundered cash. Still, he knew the landscape was changing. Each headline was another reason for politicians to score points by promising his capture. Each televised raid, even the ones that turned up nothing, was a reminder that the walls were slowly closing in. Beira-Mar responded by retreating even further into the shadows. He stopped attending meetings in person, unless absolutely necessary, relying instead on encrypted messages and trusted couriers. Safe houses were abandoned at the first sign of surveillance. Lieutenants who attracted too much attention were quietly reassigned or removed. Do you remember the high-profile raid on the favela complex where police were convinced they would catch him? The operation ended in a chaotic shootout, but Beira-Mar was never there. Residents claimed he had left hours before, slipping through a hidden tunnel network that only a handful of his men knew about. As he watched the footage of that raid on the evening news, Beira-Mar understood that the game had entered a new phase. He could no longer rely solely on bribes and goodwill. The media spotlight had made him a symbol, and symbols are dangerous because they inspire action. For now, though, his empire stood firm. He had weathered betrayal, law enforcement raids, and relentless headlines. But deep down, he sensed that the margin for error was shrinking. And in that quiet realization, Beira-Mar began preparing for storms yet to come. The storms arrived in the form of secret meetings deep in the Colombian jungle. Beira-Mar's alliance with the FARC had been running smoothly for years, but the guerrilla commanders now demanded more. They wanted heavier weaponry, grenade launchers, machine guns, explosives, to fortify their war against the Colombian government. In exchange, they promised to increase the volume of cocaine flowing through Beira-Mar's routes. These meetings were tense affairs. Beira-Mar would travel with a skeleton crew, leaving Brazil behind for days at a time, moving quietly along unmarked trails until he reached the guerrilla camps. The FARC leaders were always wary, even of their long-standing partners. Around the fire at night, conversations were clipped and guarded, every word carrying the weight of potential betrayal. Historical fact. During this period, FARC camps operated as self-contained fortresses, complete with classrooms, infirmaries, and armories. Their control of rural Colombia was so absolute that even military operations often failed to penetrate these strongholds. Beira-Mar delivered the weapons they requested, sourcing them from his Paraguayan connections and other black market brokers. In return, his cocaine shipments expanded, the profits from each container dwarfing anything he had previously imagined. But this success came at a cost: greater exposure. Transporting larger volumes meant using more boats, more couriers, more intermediaries, and every new link in the chain was a potential weakness. Do you remember the night when a convoy of 3 riverboats nearly collided with a Colombian army patrol? Beira-Mar's men barely escaped into the fog, abandoning a portion of the shipment to avoid capture. That incident rattled him, not just because of the lost product, but because it proved how fragile even the most carefully laid plans could be. Many people still think that the FARC alliance, though profitable, was the beginning of his undoing. So what do you think? Was expanding his ties to the guerrillas a strategic masterstroke? Or was it a gamble that ultimately raised the stakes too high? Beira-Mar wasn't blind to the risks. He began diversifying his supply sources even more aggressively, forging relationships with independent Colombian producers and smaller cartels. These groups lacked the military might of the FARC, but they offered something just as valuable: discretion. Still, he couldn't completely disentangle himself from the guerrillas. Their reach was too vast, their control over coca-producing territories too complete. And Beira-Mar understood that walking away from an alliance with an armed group was not a simple matter. Back in Brazil, he tightened his organization's security. Safe houses in the favelas were reinforced with steel doors and escape tunnels. Port operations became even more compartmentalized, with separate crews handling each stage of the process so that no one could map the entire network. Do you remember the day he ordered all cell phones destroyed and replaced with encrypted radios? It was a costly move, but Beira-Mar knew that law enforcement had begun tapping phones. He would not allow a careless conversation to bring down everything he had built. Yet, even with these precautions, cracks began to show. Federal police had started sharing intelligence with international agencies, and the DEA was quietly feeding Brazilian investigators information about shipments linked to the FARC. Each seizure, each intercepted container, brought Beira-Mar's name deeper into the spotlight. He responded by withdrawing even further from day-to-day operations, becoming a true phantom. Lieutenants who needed his approval for major decisions received it through intermediaries. Few people saw his face anymore, and those who did were sworn to absolute secrecy. But the jungle meetings weighed on him. He could sense the FARC commanders growing bolder, their demands escalating. They saw Beira-Mar's success and wanted a larger share, a tighter grip on the partnership. As he crossed back into Brazil after one such meeting, Beira-Mar stared at the vast expanse of jungle around him and wondered if the forest itself was closing in. The routes that had once seemed untouchable now felt like corridors narrowing with each passing month, and somewhere in that vast green wilderness, he knew a misstep could end everything. The pressure mounting in Colombia and Brazil pushed Beira-Mar to make a decision he had long avoided, stepping out of Brazil for an extended period. By the early 2000s, law enforcement operations at the ports and in the favelas were becoming more frequent and better coordinated. His network could still function without him present, but the heat in Rio was intensifying. Paraguay, with its lax oversight and friendly contacts, became his temporary sanctuary. Paraguay had always been an essential cog in his machine. He had cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, arms dealers and smugglers in Ciudad del Este and Pedro Juan Caballero. There, the border was a line on a map, not a meaningful barrier. Trucks, boats, and even small aircraft slipped back and forth every day, carrying everything from counterfeit electronics to military-grade weapons. Historical fact: the tri-border area, where Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina meet, is one of the most notorious smuggling zones in the world. Authorities from all three countries have long struggled to police the constant movement of contraband. Do you remember the villa he rented on the outskirts of Ciudad del Este? It wasn't extravagant, just private and secure, surrounded by high walls and patrolled by trusted guards. From this hideout, Beira-Mar could oversee his operations while remaining far from the cameras and helicopters hovering over Rio. His lieutenants carried on the daily work in Brazil, funneling cocaine through ports and jungle routes, laundering money through fishing fleets and real estate. Beira-Mar's absence even gave the organization an unexpected advantage. Law enforcement assumed that his physical presence was necessary for the network to function, and they underestimated how well trained his lieutenants were. But exile came with its own challenges. Paraguay was full of other criminal groups vying for control of the same smuggling routes. Some resented Beira-Mar's presence, fearing he would bring unwanted attention from Brazilian authorities. Skirmishes over territory and weapons deals became common, and Beira-Mar had to deploy his trademark combination of diplomacy and force to maintain his footing. Do you remember the border town meeting with a rival Paraguayan faction? They sat across from each other in a back room of a dingy restaurant, the air heavy with cigarette smoke. The rival leader suggested a truce, offering to divide smuggling corridors. Beira-Mar agreed, for now. He understood that truces in this world were temporary, and he made plans accordingly. Many people still think that his time in Paraguay marked the height of his empire. So, what do you think? Did distance from Brazil make him stronger? Or did it plant the seeds of his downfall? Beira-Mar also used his time in exile to shore up international connections. He dispatched emissaries to Europe and West Africa, exploring new markets and shipping routes. These meetings hinted at an ambition that extended far beyond South America. Yet even in Paraguay, the shadow of Brazilian law enforcement loomed large. Federal investigators back home had not forgotten him. They were tightening their grip on the favelas and ports, seeking to cut off his financial and logistical lifelines. Each week brought news of a small seizure, a mid-level manager arrested, a bank account frozen. And while Beira-Mar could adapt to these disruptions, he knew that the tightening noose would eventually follow him across the border. Do you remember the day one of his trusted couriers arrived at the villa with a panicked look? He had heard whispers that Brazilian authorities were planning a joint operation with Paraguay's police, using intelligence from international partners. Beira-Mar listened silently, the weight of the information sinking in. He realized that his Paraguayan sanctuary might not be as secure as he believed. He began making contingency plans. New safe houses deeper in the interior, fresh escape routes along the river, backup cash stashes scattered across the region. He had lived his life preparing for worst-case scenarios, and he knew this one was coming. But even as he mapped out his next move, he could feel the walls closing in, mile by mile. The Paraguayan villa became both sanctuary and cage. Beira-Mar's network was still functioning, but from his hideout he could feel the pressure building. Each phone call brought word of another bank account frozen, another ally under surveillance, another shipment intercepted before it reached the ports. His lieutenants assured him the empire was holding strong, but Beira-Mar knew better. The foundation was beginning to crack. Money was the first sign. The laundering operations that had seemed airtight were drawing scrutiny. Brazilian financial investigators, armed with new tools and cooperation from international banks, were beginning to track suspicious transfers. Offshore accounts in Antigua and Panama that had once been invisible were now flagged for review. Some funds were frozen entirely, forcing Beira-Mar to reroute millions through more convoluted channels. Historical fact: around 2001, Brazil joined an international task force designed to combat money laundering, creating stronger cooperation with foreign banks and making it harder for traffickers to hide illicit profits. Do you remember the night he sat in the villa's study, staring at ledgers brought by one of his accountants? For the first time, the numbers weren't reassuring. Payments to suppliers and lieutenants were being delayed. Bribes to politicians and police had to be reduced. Beira-Mar understood the danger. If people stopped getting paid on time, their loyalty could waver. Many people still think that the tightening financial net was the beginning of the end for Beira-Mar. So, what do you think? Could his empire have survived if the money had kept flowing freely? He responded by liquidating some of his assets. Real estate holdings were sold through shell companies, and the proceeds funneled into cash reserves. Fishing fleets were scaled back, with boats quietly decommissioned and sold. He even cut back on some of the community projects in the favelas, knowing it would cost him goodwill, but buying him precious liquidity. But while he shored up his finances, investigators were closing in from another angle: human intelligence. A lieutenant arrested in Rio began cooperating, feeding small details to prosecutors in exchange for leniency. The information was enough to map out pieces of Beira-Mar's Paraguayan operations, including the safe houses and river routes he depended on. Do you remember the report about a small convoy ambushed near the border? The attackers weren't rivals. They were Paraguayan police tipped off by Brazilian intelligence. The seized cargo was modest, but the incident confirmed what Beira-Mar already feared. His sanctuary was compromised. He doubled his security, surrounding himself with loyal guards who lived and worked at the villa. Any visitor was searched thoroughly, and meetings were conducted in a soundproof room. He even stopped traveling to Ciudad del Este, conducting all business through intermediaries. Still, the leaks continued. Investigators in Brazil and Paraguay, aided by DEA analysts, were piecing together his network with growing precision. For the first time in years, Beira-Mar felt like the hunted rather than the hunter. Do you remember the coded message intercepted by Brazilian police, revealing a scheduled shipment along a river route? They allowed it to proceed, tracking it silently as it wound its way into Brazilian territory. When the ambush came, the crew was captured without firing a shot. Beira-Mar knew he couldn't afford to wait for the next raid to come to his doorstep. He began preparing to move deeper into the Paraguayan interior, away from the border towns where his presence was increasingly obvious. New safe houses were stocked with cash, weapons, and supplies. Escape routes were mapped down to the last detail, but as he prepared to vanish once again, Beira-Mar couldn't ignore the growing sense that time was running out. Each move he made was being watched, each transaction tracked, and in a world where even the most trusted allies could turn, he wondered if he had already been betrayed once more. Even as the empire showed signs of strain, one of its strongest pillars remained the loyalty of the dock workers at Brazil's ports. These men and women had been on Beira-Mar's payroll for years, quietly facilitating the flow of cocaine hidden in cargo containers. They were the invisible hands guiding the lifeblood of his operation, and Beira-Mar knew that without them, the arteries would clog. The docks were a world of their own. Towering cranes moved containers with hypnotic precision. Trucks rumbled along narrow lanes, and the air smelled of salt and diesel. Beira-Mar's influence here wasn't just financial, it was familial. Dock workers earned steady stipends for their silence and received bonuses for ensuring that certain containers passed uninspected. Many had used the money to send their children to better schools or to build homes far from the crime-ridden neighborhoods where they once lived. Historical fact. In the early 2000s, Brazilian federal investigations uncovered evidence of widespread corruption in port operations, particularly at the Port of Santos, one of the busiest in Latin America. Do you remember the day a dock foreman quietly tipped Beira-Mar's men off about a planned police inspection? His warning allowed them to reroute a shipment before it could be intercepted, saving millions. That kind of loyalty couldn't be bought in a single transaction. It was cultivated over years of mutual benefit. Many people still think that these dock workers were the keystone of his entire operation. So, what do you think? Could Beira-Mar's empire have functioned without this web of quiet insiders? But loyalty was not absolute. The growing pressure from federal investigators was beginning to test even the most committed allies. Undercover agents were infiltrating the docks, posing as laborers to gather intelligence. Surveillance cameras were installed in key areas, and random container inspections increased. For the first time, the dock workers felt the weight of scrutiny, and some began to question whether the money was worth the risk. Beira-Mar sensed the shift and acted swiftly. He increased payouts to those closest to him, reminding them of the benefits his network had provided. He also rotated personnel frequently, making it harder for investigators to establish patterns. Dock workers who had been in the same position for too long were reassigned or quietly retired, replaced by new recruits vetted through layers of intermediaries. Do you remember the night when one of his trusted dock workers was arrested by federal police? He faced the kind of sentence that could keep him behind bars for decades. Yet he refused to cooperate, even under intense interrogation. When word of his silence reached the favelas, Beira-Mar made sure the man's family was taken care of, their bills paid, and their safety guaranteed. Despite these efforts, the ports were becoming a dangerous place. Each shipment now carried a heightened sense of risk. The margin for error was shrinking, and Beira-Mar knew that one major seizure could trigger a chain reaction. He considered scaling back operations, but that would mean conceding ground to rivals eager to exploit any sign of weakness. Instead, he doubled down on security. Containers were fitted with sophisticated tamper-evident seals, and couriers were trained to spot surveillance. Meetings with port contacts became less frequent and were always conducted through intermediaries. Do you remember the interception of a container bound for Europe, where investigators found 120 kilos of cocaine hidden in industrial machinery? That seizure was a wake-up call. It proved that even the most carefully concealed shipments could be discovered, and it rattled Beira-Mar's confidence in the port's safety, but he couldn't abandon them. The ports were the gateway to the international markets that made his empire profitable. Without them, the operation would wither. As Beira-Mar sat in his Paraguayan hideout reviewing the latest shipment reports, he understood the paradox. The docks were both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. And he knew that if investigators managed to flip just one key dock worker, the entire network could collapse like a house of cards. The alliance with the FARC, once the backbone of Beira-Mar's supply chain, was starting to fray at the edges. Colombian guerrilla commanders, emboldened by their growing power, began making demands that Beira-Mar considered unreasonable. They wanted larger shipments of weapons, more control over routes, and a greater share of the profits. The balance of the partnership was shifting, and Beira-Mar knew that if he didn't act carefully, it could all come crashing down. He had always treated his relationship with the FARC like a delicate negotiation. They provided access to coca-producing territories, and he supplied the firepower and logistics to move the product into Brazil. But now, the guerrillas saw an opportunity to exert more influence, and they were pushing hard. Historical fact: by the early 2000s, the FARC's drug operations were estimated to generate hundreds of millions annually, and their increasing militarization made them formidable even to state forces. Do you remember the meeting held deep in the jungle, where the FARC commanders laid out their new terms? The camp was a sea of camouflage and rifles, and Beira-Mar listened carefully, his expression unreadable. He knew that rejecting the demands outright could provoke retaliation, but agreeing would give the FARC too much leverage over his operations. Many people still think that this was the turning point where his grip on the supply chain weakened. So what do you think? Should he have conceded more to maintain the alliance, or was standing firm the only way to preserve his autonomy? Beira-Mar chose a middle path. He increased the weapons shipments slightly, enough to appease the guerrillas for the moment, but he also began seeking alternative suppliers. Smaller Colombian cartels, independent producers, and even Bolivian groups became part of a new web of contacts designed to reduce his dependence on the FARC. This diversification carried its own risks. New suppliers lacked the FARC's discipline and infrastructure, and their territories were often contested. One shipment from a Bolivian contact was hijacked by a rival group before it even reached the Brazilian border, resulting in significant losses. But Beira-Mar considered it a necessary cost of loosening the guerrillas' hold over him. Do you remember the shipment that was split into 3 separate routes to minimize the risk of interception? 2 of the convoys made it through, but the 3rd was ambushed, and the crew was killed. Beira-Mar's lieutenants urged retaliation, but he held back. Open warfare would only draw more attention from law enforcement. Back in Brazil, the strain on the alliance began to show in subtle ways. The FARC was slower to fulfill shipments, and the quality of the product they provided sometimes dipped. Beira-Mar compensated by blending it with higher-grade cocaine from other suppliers, but he knew that these were temporary fixes. At the same time, law enforcement pressure was mounting. Brazilian federal police, now working closely with international partners, were focusing on the river routes that had once seemed untouchable. Patrols increased, and intelligence operations targeted the jungle corridors linking Colombia and Brazil. Beira-Mar responded by shifting some shipments through the ports exclusively, bypassing the river routes entirely. This move increased the load on his dockside operations, making them even more critical and vulnerable. Do you remember the intercepted shipment in the Amazon, where investigators discovered an entire warehouse stocked with product waiting to be moved downstream? The bust made national headlines and prompted political leaders to call for more resources to dismantle Beira-Mar's network. The shifting dynamics left him with fewer certainties than ever before. He couldn't fully rely on the FARC, and his alternative suppliers were unpredictable. The ports were under unprecedented scrutiny, and the river routes were no longer as safe as they once were. As he sat in his Paraguayan hideout reviewing intelligence reports, Beira-Mar understood that the empire he had built was entering a fragile phase. One mistake, one betrayal, one unlucky interception could set off a cascade he might not be able to control. And for the first time, the ghost-like calm that had always defined him began to crack at the edges. Police raids were becoming an almost daily reality in the favelas. Beira-Mar's network had grown used to law enforcement pressure, but the frequency and intensity of the operations in early 2002 felt different. Federal and state police, bolstered by intelligence from international agencies, were targeting warehouses, safe houses, and known associates with surgical precision. Entire neighborhoods would wake to the sound of helicopters hovering overhead, sirens wailing as armored vehicles pushed through narrow streets. In many ways, this was the inevitable response to years of embarrassment. Beira-Mar's ability to slip through law enforcement's fingers had made the authorities look inept, and now political leaders were demanding results. Officers worked overtime, sometimes without sleep, combing through the maze-like alleys of Rio's favelas for any sign of the elusive kingpin. Historical fact: by 2002, Brazil's federal government had begun launching large-scale joint operations with state police to combat organized crime in Rio de Janeiro. These raids often involved hundreds of officers and military support. Do you remember the massive operation in the Complexo do Alamo, one of Rio's most notorious favela complexes? Police stormed the area with armored vehicles, searching for a cache of weapons and drugs linked to Beira-Mar. They seized several firearms and arrested a handful of mid-level managers, but once again, the man himself was nowhere to be found. Many people still think that these raids, though disruptive, failed to weaken Beira-Mar's core network. So what do you think? Did they make him stronger by forcing him to adapt? Or did they quietly erode his foundation? Beira-Mar had anticipated these crackdowns. He had ordered his lieutenants to keep only minimal stockpiles of drugs and weapons in any single location. If a warehouse was raided, the losses would be manageable. He also instructed them to move operations frequently, never using the same safe house or port route for long. But the raids still caused damage. Each arrest risked exposing another piece of the network. Each seizure tightened the financial pressure, and each day brought the possibility that someone, somewhere, might break under interrogation. Do you remember the story of the warehouse manager who was caught with 50 kilos of cocaine during a raid? He held out for days, refusing to talk, but eventually cracked, revealing a handful of addresses used by Beira-Mar's lieutenants. The information led to more arrests and more seizures. Beira-Mar responded by severing lines of communication. Orders were now delivered through encrypted radios or trusted couriers, and anyone caught with a phone number linked to him was immediately cut off. This compartmentalization kept the network functional, but it also created frustration among lieutenants who felt increasingly isolated. At the ports, security tightened. Customs officials, under pressure from the media and their superiors, conducted more thorough inspections. Beira-Mar's dockside allies were stretched thin, and the bribes required to keep them compliant grew larger. Yet, despite all this, the empire endured. Shipments still made it through, albeit in smaller volumes. Money still flowed, though it was harder to move discreetly. And Beira-Mar remained as elusive as ever, a phantom whose name haunted police briefings and news headlines alike. Do you remember the televised press conference where a senior police commander vowed to capture Beira-Mar within the year? His words made for a dramatic soundbite, but Beira-Mar, watching from his Paraguayan hideout, simply smirked. He had heard it all before, but privately, he knew the situation was becoming untenable. Each raid, each arrest, each intercepted shipment chipped away at the empire he had spent decades building. And the more the authorities tightened their grip, the harder it would be to slip away unnoticed when the time came. As 2002 unfolded, Beira-Mar's influence began seeping into places most traffickers never dared to tread, the corridors of municipal and even state politics. He had long understood that money could buy silence, but now he sought to leverage it to actively shape policy. His lieutenants funneled campaign donations through layers of shell companies, ensuring that candidates who quietly aligned with his interests had a better chance of winning office. Historical fact: corruption scandals tied to campaign financing were rampant in Brazil during this era, with criminal groups frequently accused of bankrolling candidates in exchange for political protection. Do you remember the city council race in Rio, where a previously unknown candidate suddenly ran a lavish, well-funded campaign? Billboards, glossy mailers, and TV spots appeared overnight. Insiders whispered that the money had come from Beira-Mar's network, though nothing could be proven. The candidate won, and within months, municipal contracts that had once created logistical headaches for Beira-Mar's operations were smoothed out. Many people still think this political infiltration was a stroke of genius. So what do you think? Was Beira-Mar strengthening his empire by embedding himself in politics? Or was he courting a level of visibility he could never control? Beira-Mar himself was careful not to be seen. He never met politicians directly, preferring to send trusted intermediaries. Any hint of personal involvement could undo the web of plausible deniability he had spent years weaving. The influence extended beyond city councils. State-level legislators and even members of Congress were rumored to have accepted campaign donations indirectly tied to Beira-Mar. These relationships paid dividends when law enforcement budgets were debated or when oversight committees decided which investigations to prioritize. Do you remember the controversial decision by a state government to delay funding for a new port security initiative? Critics claimed the move benefited traffickers, though officials denied any connection. Beira-Mar, from his hideout, saw it as proof that his investments in politics were yielding returns. Yet this infiltration carried enormous risk. Journalists were digging deeper into the source of campaign contributions, and the public was increasingly sensitive to corruption scandals. One expose in a major newspaper revealed that a high-ranking legislator had received donations funneled through a company later linked to Beira-Mar's laundering network. The legislator resigned in disgrace, and though Beira-Mar's name was never mentioned, he felt the net tightening. Do you remember the coded message he sent to his lieutenants after that scandal broke? "No one is untouchable. Pull back before we burn." It was a rare admission of vulnerability. At the same time, law enforcement was focusing more attention on the ports and the financial networks that sustained his empire. Customs inspections became increasingly aggressive, and financial crimes units were scrutinizing every major transaction connected to companies in Beira-Mar's orbit. He adapted as best he could, scaling back political donations and diverting money to less visible community projects. But the political infiltration, once a source of strength, was becoming a double-edged sword. The higher his influence reached, the more enemies he made among those who feared exposure. Do you remember the press conference where a federal prosecutor vowed to root out the shadow behind the donations? Beira-Mar, watching from afar, understood that they were speaking about him, even if they couldn't yet prove it. He knew then that his empire had grown too large, too complex. The very strategies that had once kept him safe, political influence, community goodwill, sprawling networks of intermediaries, were now drawing dangerous levels of attention, and for the first time, Beira-Mar allowed himself to consider the unthinkable, that the empire might one day collapse, not because of a single raid or betrayal, but because it had simply become too big to hide. Foreign agencies had been quietly watching Beira-Mar's rise for years, but by 2002, their patience had run out. The DEA, Interpol, and other international law enforcement organizations began collaborating with Brazilian authorities in earnest, pooling intelligence and resources to map the entirety of his empire. Shipments that once moved effortlessly through ports were now subject to hidden trackers and undercover agents. The game had shifted, and Beira-Mar could feel the invisible net drawing tighter. Historical fact. Around this time, international law enforcement agencies significantly increased their presence in South America, focusing on cross-border operations to dismantle large trafficking networks. These efforts often involved sharing surveillance data and coordinating raids across multiple countries simultaneously. Do you remember the first major shipment that was flagged by international intelligence? It was bound for Europe, concealed in industrial machinery, and was intercepted before leaving Brazilian waters. The seizure cost Beira-Mar millions and tipped him off that his network was being penetrated from angles he couldn't fully see. Many people still think that foreign involvement doomed Beira-Mar's operation from the start. So what do you think? Could he have ever survived once the DEA and Interpol committed themselves fully to the hunt? Beira-Mar responded with his usual blend of caution and adaptation. He stopped relying on large single shipments, opting instead for smaller loads that could be distributed across multiple containers. He also shifted more product through land routes and river corridors, even though they were slower and riskier, to avoid the heightened scrutiny at the ports. But these changes came at a cost. The smaller shipments reduced profits and increased the number of people involved in transportation, which created more potential leaks. And even as he diversified, investigators were mapping out his connections with a precision that was impossible in the past. Financial analysts traced laundering patterns through offshore banks, while undercover agents built profiles of his lieutenants and couriers. Do you remember the sting operation in which an undercover agent posed as a corrupt dock worker? He spent months building trust before finally gaining access to a container shipment. The bust that followed led to a treasure trove of evidence, including shipping manifests and coded communications that tied Beira-Mar's organization directly to the cocaine trade. Beira-Mar knew that every seized shipment, every flipped courier, was another piece of a puzzle being assembled by people who wouldn't stop until they saw the whole picture. He tightened security further, isolating himself from even his most trusted lieutenants, but he could sense the walls closing in. The pressure began to weigh heavily on his lieutenants. Some resented the constant paranoia and the reduced payouts caused by shrinking profits. A few disappeared entirely, and Beira-Mar couldn't be sure whether they had defected, been arrested, or simply fled. Do you remember the international press conference where representatives from multiple countries stood together, vowing to dismantle his empire? It was a symbolic moment, one that signaled the full weight of international law enforcement was now aligned against him. Beira-Mar, watching from a secure house in Paraguay, remained outwardly calm, but he understood the implications. He had built an empire designed to withstand Brazilian law enforcement, using corruption, community ties, and compartmentalization to stay a step ahead. But foreign agencies brought resources and reach that he couldn't easily counter. Offshore accounts could be frozen, shell companies exposed, and international partners pressured into cooperation. And perhaps most dangerously, these agencies were patient. They didn't need to seize every shipment or arrest every lieutenant. They only needed to gather enough evidence to justify one decisive strike. As Beira-Mar reviewed reports from his lieutenants, he knew that strike was coming. The only question was when, and whether he could slip away one more time before it did. The decisive blow began not with a raid, but with a conversation. One of Beira-Mar's most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been by his side for over a decade, quietly flipped. Arrested in a sting operation that uncovered millions in cash and incriminating shipping documents, the lieutenant faced a future of decades behind bars. Faced with that reality, he made the choice Beira-Mar feared most: cooperation. The information he provided was a map of the empire: safe houses, stash points, key lieutenants' roles, financial networks, all laid out in meticulous detail. Brazilian authorities, working closely with international partners, now had a blueprint for dismantling the organization from top to bottom. Historical fact: law enforcement agencies around the world have long relied on flipped insiders to bring down large criminal networks. In Brazil, such deals often resulted in reduced sentences in exchange for actionable intelligence. Do you remember the series of coordinated raids that followed? Federal police hit warehouses in Rio and São Paulo simultaneously, seizing tons of product and millions in cash. International agencies froze offshore accounts tied to Beira-Mar's front companies, cutting off access to vast sums of money. It was the largest operation ever mounted against his network. Many people still think this was the moment that truly broke Beira-Mar's grip on power. So what do you think? Could he have recovered from the betrayal of a lieutenant who knew so much? Beira-Mar, in his Paraguayan hideout, knew the betrayal had changed everything. He no longer trusted anyone completely. He moved constantly, abandoning safe houses after only a few nights, carrying only what he could load into a convoy of SUVs. His guards were on edge, scanning the horizon for signs of ambush. Do you remember the day his convoy was nearly intercepted on a dirt road near the Brazilian border? Paraguayan police, acting on intelligence from Brazilian authorities, had set up an ambush. But Beira-Mar's lead vehicle spotted the checkpoint in time, and the convoy veered off into the jungle. It was a narrow escape, one that left everyone shaken. He could feel the noose tightening. International task forces were coordinating at a level he had never seen before, and he no longer had the luxury of time. Each move he made seemed to be anticipated, each escape route closing behind him. The betrayal also sent shockwaves through the ranks. Lieutenants who had once been unquestioningly loyal now wondered if Beira-Mar could truly protect them. Some fled, others cut side deals with rivals, and still others quietly reached out to law enforcement in the hopes of securing leniency. Do you remember the coded message he sent to his remaining inner circle? We burn the bridges and we hold the river. It was both a warning and a declaration. The empire was entering its final stand. The betrayal was devastating, but it also hardened Beira-Mar's resolve. He knew capture was likely, but he would not go down without a fight. He armed his security teams with the weapons stockpiled from his Paraguayan contacts, fortified his hideouts, and prepared for the inevitable. But even as he prepared, he knew that the forces aligned against him were overwhelming. Brazilian commandos, Paraguayan police, DEA agents, and Interpol analysts were now moving in lockstep, determined to end the reign of the man they had hunted for over a decade. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the echo of footsteps drawing closer. The end came in the humid night air along the Paraguayan border. Beira-Mar's convoy had been on the move for hours, weaving through dirt roads that cut through dense jungle. He knew the terrain well. He had chosen this area precisely because it offered countless escape routes into Brazil. But on this night in 2002, every path seemed to be watched. The intelligence provided by the flipped lieutenant had paid off. Brazilian commandos, working with Paraguayan police and international agencies, had anticipated his movements with surgical precision. Checkpoints were established at key crossings, and surveillance drones tracked the faint heat signatures of vehicles moving through the forest. Do you remember the moment the lead SUV's headlights caught the glint of a steel barricade across the road? There was no time to stop. Gunfire erupted as security forces poured out of the tree line, rifles raised. Beira-Mar's convoy scattered, engines roaring. But the jungle roads offered little room to maneuver. Historical fact. Beira-Mar's capture in 2002 was the culmination of a massive joint operation involving Brazilian federal police and Paraguay's anti-narcotics units. It was one of the largest coordinated actions against organized crime in South America at the time. Beira-Mar, sitting in the back seat of the second vehicle, remained eerily calm as bullets tore through the foliage. "Drive," he told his driver, his voice steady, but within minutes, the convoy was boxed in. One vehicle was disabled by gunfire, and another skidded into a ditch. Beira-Mar's guards returned fire, but they were outnumbered and outgunned. Do you remember the image of him being led away in handcuffs, his expression blank as cameras flashed? That photograph dominated headlines for weeks. Many Brazilians celebrated the capture, viewing it as a long overdue victory for law enforcement. Others, particularly in the favelas where he had built a reputation as a benefactor, mourned the loss of a man they believed had done more for their communities than the government ever had. Many people still think Beira-Mar's capture marked the beginning of the end for Brazil's old-school traffickers. So what do you think? Did his fall pave the way for a new, more fragmented era of organized crime? In prison, Beira-Mar was placed in a maximum security facility, but even behind bars, his reach persisted. He used lawyers, visitors, and even corrupted prison staff to relay instructions to his lieutenants. Operations continued, though diminished, and his legend only grew. Do you remember the riots in several favelas that erupted in the weeks following his arrest? Supporters clashed with police, setting fire to barricades and chanting his name. For them, Beira-Mar was more than a trafficker. He was a symbol of resistance against a system they believed had abandoned them. But the empire he had built was already unraveling. Rivals moved in to claim territory, and his lieutenants, facing their own legal troubles, struggled to maintain cohesion. The political allies he had once cultivated distanced themselves, and the international task forces dismantled his financial networks piece by piece. As Beira-Mar sat in his cell, the hum of the jungle replaced by the distant clang of prison gates, he reflected on the life he had led. He had risen from the streets of Duque de Caxias to become one of the most powerful men in Brazil's criminal underworld, only to be brought down by the same paranoia and betrayal he had tried so hard to avoid. And as the years passed, the myth of Fernandinho Beira-Mar became just that, a story told and retold in the favelas and ports where his shadow had once loomed large. And now, as we close the chapter on Fernandinho Beira-Mar, let the tension slowly fade from your shoulders. You've been following a story of power and survival, betrayal and capture, through bustling ports, jungle hideouts, and fortified favelas. But for the next few moments, let your mind drift away from the darkness of his world and focus instead on something calmer, gentler. Picture a warm breeze moving through tall trees, the leaves swaying softly in the night air. Imagine the distant sound of waves against a shoreline, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat you can trust. The jungle, which once held so many secrets for Beira-Mar, now becomes a place of peace in your mind, a sanctuary where no one is hunting and nothing is hiding. Breathe in slowly, letting the air fill your lungs. Hold it for a moment, then exhale, releasing whatever tension you've carried with you through this journey. Do it again, a little deeper this time. Feel your body soften as the rhythm of your breathing slows everything down. The story we've just shared is one of ambition and consequence. But here, in this quiet moment, none of that matters. All that matters is the present, the soft hum of the world around you, the safety of your space, the comfort of knowing you can let go. So, as you lay your head down, let the images of distant ports and crowded favelas fade. Replace them with still water, a quiet horizon, and the gentle assurance that, at least for tonight, you can rest. Sweet dreams.